in 1949, all the women came for family reunion. Because of the war, Australia allowed them into the country. And that's when my grandfather had my aunties teach us religion. And we had to wear their Indian clothes, sawars and kameez. We weren't allowed to wear Western clothes at home. We had to come firmly under their control. My father bought a big house at Wynnum called Pakistan House. And there was one room in the house for each family. And there were big verandas around. We didn't have a big family in 1949, so we all used to go over and have lessons in Arabic. The only trouble was, it was blind faith. You could say all the prayers and everything, but you didn't know what you were saying. They didn't want men to teach the girls. So we had to go to Catholic schools. My grandfather, he was well known in the community. He used to have a lot of functions. He had Selwyn House in Streathhead up in Wickham Terrace, and he used to have big parties, and he knew all the contacts. And it was, he was a friend of Archbishop Dewey, so he got us into the Catholic schools because we weren't Catholics. But he got us into the Catholic schools, and we learnt the Catholic religion, and we could understand the Catholic religion. So I used to say my prayers in the English, in the Catholic religion, and Arabic in the Muslim religion, not understanding the Muslim prayers because we had no translations. So when the educated people came out, they brought the translations out. And then we, even most of my life, I had a religious conflict. I didn't know whether I was Christian or Muslim. So I kept to my religion, but I still had a conflict with religion. And my husband, because he was brought up in an orphanage when his parents split up, he didn't follow any religion, you know. But when I married him, I said to him, "You've got to follow my religion if I marry you." And he promised he did, but he never did, you know. But he loved the association with Muslims when we had Eid or when we had functions. He liked to go along to them, you know. We did have mostly Indian cooking in our house, you know, because we were influenced by the women that came in. Because Mum worked, our family had cafes and businesses, and Mum worked most of her life. So we would either have one of our aunties living with us. When my father, in 1949, my father brought his first wife here and his son, and she stayed in our house. She was in purdah because she came from the war. She wouldn't open the door to anybody. She couldn't speak English, but she stayed home and cooked for us and looked after us, you know. They stayed in the same house. We ended up moving a few times. We lived in South Brisbane and Cordelia and Merivale Street. Then we went to New Farm, near where in those days they called it the Spastic Centre. It wasn't too far. We lived in Mountford Road. And then when the house burnt down and we lost our home and my little sister died in the fire, we bought a house in Brunswick Street, New Farm, a pretty big house at 10 bedrooms. We had Aboriginal housemaids come and help. You know how they had the Aboriginal women? So we had young Aboriginal housemaids to help. Mum worked, but she'd breastfeed all the children. She did all the office work or all the book work, you know. 'Cause she was very good with figures. She only went to grade 5 because it was war years, and my grandfather took her up to Tennant Creek. But she was an avid reader, and she did follow the religion. She did follow the religion when she married my father. It was only after my father died in 1957, and my grandfather took our house because he lost Selwyn House in Strathhead because Union College at the university took it over, and then later it was demolished to make that road up there in Wickham Terrace. So my grandfather then wanted our house because we had 10 bedrooms and he had sailors coming from India and all of that. So we had to go and live with him. We had to live under strict Muslim conditions. My grandfather wouldn't let us out of the door once we got home. We weren't allowed to come home from school in the bus. I had to stay at some of our house with the boarders until somebody came and picked me up to go home. And then my mother found out that he was going to marry us to our first cousins. So when he was out one day, she packed us up and moved out. And Aisha and I had to drop out of school and go to work to help Mum bring up the children. And then Mum was very free, but she was very lonely. And it was only when Rahila grew up and she worked at McGregor State School, she was in the office, she met a pastor from America, and Rahila was very influenced by him. And then she became Church of Christ, and then she influenced the three youngest ones in the family, my brother Sayed and my brother Yusuf, and Rahila and Mum, and they became Church of Christ. Because Mum liked the interaction. She didn't get it from the Muslims at that time, because she kept away from the mosque because she didn't want her children to have arranged weddings. She wanted us to have freedom, and bring us up like Australians. But I was influenced very much by my father. And one thing, growing up under the White Australia policy had big influence on me. I was proud of my colour, and I didn't want to marry out of my religion. So I had trouble finding someone to marry. I had some pen friends overseas, and then one of them, I was going to go over to Malaysia, marry this guy, and then I found out he was married, and I said, no, I'm not going through that. And then when my mother got a house at Thirlby Street, Mancravat, and my father-in-law got a house at Newnham Road, and he came courting my mother because he was divorcee and she was a widower. And Mum didn't want any more Deen. So I ended up meeting my third cousin, and I ended up marrying him because most of the other men in our age group married Australians. And I couldn't marry out of my religion, and I didn't have an arranged wedding. I had a wedding of choice, but I told my husband he had to follow my religion. He did in the beginning, but it was too hard for him, because he was very Australian, He was a sportsman and everything like that, He was a sprinter, and he was a rugby league player and a rugby union player and all of that. Oh, it is different. In the beginning, we had a very good, we had a lot of part-time imams that travelled through. Mubarak Mullah was the first one. He was going to be a settled imam, but he died. And then his children, and I know some of them today, their mother had died in childbirth, and the children were taken over by the Cause family because they were going to be put in orphanages. And when Mrs. Cause died, then they ran away to somewhere where Castledene College is now. And then they were put into orphanages. It was really sad. So Mubarak Mullah was supposed to be, he was a first imam. And then we had other imams coming on part-time basis. We had Fazl Ahmed from India, and he passed away. And then we had Abdul Rahim Rain, who is an Australian of Indian origin, and the Rain family and our family were one of the first families here. And he taught himself the religion from books and magazines. He read some Ahmadiyya magazine or something like that and learnt a lot from the Ahmadiyyas, as a matter of fact, believe it or not. And then he got a lot of translations, and he became our imam for 30 years. He was the best imam we ever had, even up to this day, because he was an Aussie that understood the Australian community, and he understood the religion because his father taught him a little bit, but his father was in Arabic too. His father taught him the Arabic, but he taught him how to wash the bodies when people died and how to perform weddings and all of that. So he did have some guidance from his father, and he studied. He was an avid reader.
So Islam is outward and inward. Just outward is not enough. You've got to know the inward Islam. If the parents only knew the reality of Islam and how much a blessing it is that they rear their children in Islam to be good citizens. Islam is not just, you teach your children to pray either. No. He's got to pray. That is a fard on the first thing. But that's only his duty to his Creator. Huh? We pray because that's a duty to the Creator. It's a debt we owe to our Creator. But what about behaving in the society? To be good, not hurt anybody. To be kind to everybody. To be charitable. Right? And to know how to go about this is what we want. How to make these older people understand that. They'll pick a quarrel very quick. They will hurt one another. Some of them will kill one another. You see, and they profess to be Muslim. Muslim means much more than being Muslim. Muslim means I am a submitter. I submit to the will of Allah. And if you're a submitter to the will of Allah, you will live in peace with everybody.
He understood how to teach us and everything, even though he had people helping with the madrasa classes as they came out from Bosnia and the European countries. We had a lot of the people that came from the war over there, and they were a little bit strict in that they used to smack the children and all of that. Fakir Baitia came. Fakir is still alive today. He's in his 90s. He taught a lot of the madrasa children, and he ended up he got married, and that marriage broke up. But he was dedicated to the mosque. He even painted the sign at the mosque and everything like that. He was a madrasa teacher. The madrasa teachers taught the way they were taught in their countries. Spare the rod and spoil the child. And that affected a lot of the children. Abdul Rahim Rain, he was the imam, and he wasn't there all the time to teach, because believe it or not, we had the only mosque on the east coast of Australia before Sydney and Melbourne, and he travelled right up to North Queensland, right down south. He performed weddings and burials, and he was a very busy man, and he was an honorary imam. He never got paid one penny. Wow. And he never got a house or anything. He worked part-time as security for Westpac Bank and all of that. But he ended up bringing all of his children, every one of his children and offspring follow the religion. And his son Jamal goes and puts up mosques over in Cambodia and everything. They're very, very giving to the community. Osman runs the Muslim Charitable Foundation. Their business is ABD Poultry, and they supply a lot of the chicken for functions and everything like that. Abdul Rahim Rain left a big legacy. We integrated into society in the early days. That's why we never had any trouble. In the early days, everybody, all religions, wore hats and everything into their prayer places. And we, the Muslim women, when you pray, you have to have it down to your wrist and down to your ankle. You have to have modest clothing. And when we went, and in the early days, women hardly ever went to the mosque, to tell you the honest truth. It was only when they covered in the verandas of the original Queenslander that we were allowed to go to the mosque. Some of the men wouldn't even let us go there. And like we were fighting for our rights, like women's lib. Mum's age group, there were only a few women. And we had women's auxiliaries that used to do all the work in the mosque and everything. Nowadays, they have cleaners, and the women say, let them get paid to do it, you know. But in the old days, it was a beautiful atmosphere. You know, we all used to have picnics together, and we were like one whole big family. They call it the Muslim Ummah. We all came together. And we came from many different cultures. But because women weren't brought to Australia, most of them were Australians, we integrated, you know. We only wore their head cloth and everything when we prayed. I had this religious conflict in me, and I had to solve it. So, to do the pilgrimage to Mecca, you have a lot of conditions. You have to have no debts, you have to earn the money yourself, and you had to have no responsibilities. So I had to wait until my children had grown up, until I didn't have to look after mum and all of that sort of thing. My sister had taken mum for a little while to her place, and so I had to study for 6 months to learn. I wanted to solve this conflict with my religion. I had a religious conflict, even though I'm brought up in Australia, and I wanted to find my identity in my religion. So I studied for 6 months, and at that time, towards the end of the time that I was ready to go, Abdul Rahim Rain had cancer, and he was in Greenslopes Hospital. So I used to go and sit by him and ask him how to get ready for my... I read all the literature and everything, but he used to tell me the practical things, you know. And then I didn't have a mahram. You're supposed to have a male to travel with. So I went with Our World Travel down in Newcastle, and Ismail Davids, he was the leader of the group, so I had him, but I was lucky. You couldn't have a male that you could marry as your mahram. I was lucky that Sultan and his daughters were going there, and Hanif, his younger brother. So I ended up going with Our World Travel, and they were on the same tour. But I left from Brisbane, and I had none of my family. As a matter of fact, I broke my right arm the day before I left, and my children didn't want me to go. My son said, "You can't have a plaster on your hand on the plane, Mum, it swells." I said, "That's all right, I'll have half a plaster." And they said, "You shouldn't be going, because if you die over there, you have to be buried over there. You've got to sign a letter to say you are." Even though I'm an Aussie and I want to be buried in Australia, I had to take the chance. So I ended up going over there, and when we stayed in Singapore on the way over, and then we stayed in with women in a group, and I got to know some of them. When it was funny that the lady that I was with, one of the ladies was my sister-in-law's auntie from Sydney, and the other one was a lady I knew from Algeciras, so at least I had people that I knew. And then when we went to not Rio, what's the place? When we arrived there anyway, we had to be in an airport, and we had to go by buses. Some of the people went to Medina first, and some went to Mecca. But we went to Medina, and then we had to pray in the Prophet's Mosque, and we had to learn a whole lot of things about the religion. And then one thing that I learned there was you don't cover your face. You're not to cover your face. It's only a cultural things that the Arab dream up. You're not supposed to, in the mosque in Mecca and Medina, you're not to pray with your face covered. And when I was in the mosque at Medina, the Prophet's Mosque, I actually got up to the Rada. The Rada is a special room where the Prophet's buried. So I actually got up there, and normally everybody flocks. People get crushed. Babies get crushed. They have funerals every day. And I was lucky, even though I had a broken arm, some of the men, they couldn't go in when the women went in. They all had their own turns. And I offered to wheel someone's mother in. because she was in a wheelchair, I got right up to the road and no trouble, didn't get squashed or anything. It was really, really good, you know. It was a good experience. And then when we went to Mecca, there's a whole lot of rituals they have to do there. And then I realised when I'm in Mecca, this is all from the First Testament, the Old Testament, you know. It's all Abraham's first altar and the slave girl, Abraham's slave wife, trying to find water for his son and all of that. And I realised, gee, I'm lucky I had an education in Christian schools because I learnt all about the prophets and I knew a little bit about everything. We've got all the same prophets. It really is gratifying to me to realise that even though I had all those struggles, because in the early days I didn't feel I belonged in the Muslim community or the Christian community. In the early days, because I felt an outsider of both, you know, because I didn't have all the knowledge that I should have had, you know, growing up as a child. But on the other hand, I'm really happy because it teaches me how to appreciate other religions, that we're all the same and there's only one God anyway. And even when I was at Somerville House, I learned a lot about most of my friends were Jewish, you know. Yes, and then when I was working at Elders, Pam Dalrymple from Dalrymple Bookstore, Christian Bookstore, she was the secretary, the finance manager when I first went there. I used to go to the Baptist church with her at lunchtime to pray up on the top of the hill. I don't know what religion she was, but we used to pray there on Thursdays. I said, church is where you pray. And then my girlfriend, Ruth Howard, Dorothy Howard and Ruth Howard, I met them also. Her father was a Baptist minister at Sandgate, so I sort of had a lot of contact with some of the Christian churches. I love studying comparative religions, you know, and the Hindus, because I've got a lot of Hindu friends, and I'm on organisation Gopio, of people of Indian origin. So I meet a lot of the different faiths amongst the Hindus and the Buddhists, and it's very uplifting, you know, because everybody's got to believe in something. You have to have some belief to spur you on, I feel, to give your life a meaning, I feel, and to know that you're not alone in this world, and that there's someone that you can refer to when you need any problems, you know, help you lift your burdens.